It's my great pleasure to welcome Mary Jo MacDonald for this conversation. Today we're going to discuss equality, monsters and slavery, marriage, among other things. Mary Jo completed her dissertation at Toronto University about a year ago, and so we're going to start a little bit with talking about the topics for that, which was you were discussing. The dissertation is on equality, and the idea is to bring together the more canonical philosophers who have written about equality with the non-canonical ones, meaning the women. So yeah, tell us a bit more.
Sure. When you put out my research interests like that, from monsters, equality, slavery, and marriage, it sounds quite broad. But I think of like my overarching research goal as being about turning to early modern women philosophers in order to generate insights for contemporary debates about equality. Yeah. So my dissertation is really kind of the focal point of that research agenda. And so in the dissertation, what I try and do is intervene in this debate that's happening in contemporary democratic theory about what they call basic equality. So basic equality is a question about why we think we're one another's equals. So it's not just this, we all agree that we should treat each other as equals, but why do we even think we're equal in the first place? So a lot of these debates seem to assume that if we're one another's equals, it's because we all share some capacity like reason, or maybe some other transcendental capacity like dignity. So I think what I want to do in my dissertation is show other ways of conceptualizing equality that can be found in the early modern period that aren't kind of predicated on this distinction between some transcendental capacity like reason, which we all share and it's all identical, and like differences in our bodies. So in the dissertation, I turn to several canonical thinkers like Montaigne, Hobbes, and Locke, and I show how their ideas of equality are not predicated on the idea that we all have the exact same capacities for reason. And then I show how women take up these ideas to argue for the equality of the sexes. So I put Montaigne in dialogue with his adopted daughter, Marie de Gournay. I put Hobbes in dialogue with a member of his household, Margaret Cavendish. And Locke I put in dialogue with one of his contemporaries, Judith Drake. And I show that these are all kind of pre-Cartesian theories of equality. They aren't predicated on this distinction between our rational minds and our material bodies. And in that way, they can actually be really useful for thinking about equality beyond reason. And ultimately in the dissertation, I end up kind of favoring the Hobbesian account of equality, which to many people is very surprising, because for Hobbes, equality is not a claim that we're equally rational, but that we're equally dangerous. For Hobbes, we're equal because we all have equal capacities to kill each other. And while the contemporary democratic theory debate has dismissed this as brutal, I show how, when it's taken up by Margaret Cavendish, we can begin to see the normative and rhetorical force of these arguments. Because she leverages the idea that women are equally dangerous to argue for their political inclusion. So the upshot of the dissertation is that maybe these theories which stress the dangers equals pose, rather than our rational capacities, can be really emancipatory.
I think it's really interesting, and I also think it's really interesting how you bring in the women as well, because what that came to my mind now when you kind of describe the pairs is that they are actually, so Gournay is Montaigne's adopted daughter. Also in the case of Hobbes and Cavendish, I think they knew each other, and in the case of Judith Drake and Locke, there would also be they would have known each other. So this also shows a little bit about the networks and
So it's different levels of knowing each other. So Gournay was Montaigne's adopted daughter. She was the first editor of his essays. He left her his kind of intellectual legacy. Margaret Cavendish and Hobbes, they were both in exile in France together. She was a member of Henrietta Maria's court. And then she married into the Cavendish family, who were Hobbes's patrons. So Cavendish was keen to differentiate herself from Hobbes, so she said that she didn't speak to him that much. But there is some evidence of letters that she sent him a copy of her plays.
Yeah.
So they certainly did know each other. And with John Locke and Judith Drake, the connection is a little less clear.
Yeah.
Judith Drake's husband, James Drake, was in the Royal Society at the same time as Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, and John Locke. Mm-hmm. And she clearly cites him a lot and is very familiar with Locke's essay concerning human understanding. Mm-hmm. But there's no evidence of any correspondence between the two, besides the fact that Locke owned a copy of her essay.
Yeah. And that tells a lot about kind of the ways in which women were able to enter intellectual work in the time that there were these networks. But then I think it's also because they're all critical to some. So is there something? And since you want, I mean, Hobbes is the really important one, and also kind of Cavendish is the really important one for you. I think also when you look forwards, then in the monster direction. But before we go to the monsters, I mean, is there something you would want to say about the kind of how they criticize and the kind of the intellectual dialogue between them? Do you have some form of favorite argument from any of these women in the way in which they are kind of critically?
Yeah, so all of them, it's hard to tease out the parts in which they're indebted to these canonical male authors and agreeing with them, and which parts they're disagreeing with.
Yeah.
But with Hobbes, and this is in part because it's hard to tell to what extent these male canonical thinkers are themselves kind of feminist, or at least interested in advancing the cause of women, right? There's whole books written about whether Hobbes and Locke's theories of equality can be extended to women. So I think these women writers are struggling with that themselves. They see the basis of equality, like the capacity to kill, might be a really good way of articulating sexual equality, but Hobbes himself fails to really extend it, or at least extend it consistently to women. So that's something I think Margaret Cavendish really picks up on in Hobbes. Like, there's lots of places where he seems to suggest, women are equally capable of killing men. He cites the Amazons. He brings the Amazons up in every iteration of his political theory as proof that men and women are equal. Yeah. But then he will frequently revert back to patriarchal assumptions when describing how the Commonwealth should be organized. He assumes that men will be in charge of the households, that the sovereign will most of the time, he says, be a man. Yeah. So I think that's the sort of thing that someone like Cavendish would pick at. Like, yeah, he says men and women are equal, but then he fails to really consistently show that women should be equal to men and should be treated equal to men.
Yeah. Exactly. Do you want now to say something about the transition from equality to monsters, and then also kind of how because you have already published on monsters as well, and kind of so how in more detail did this project on equality lead into a project on monsters?
Right. So since the main point of the thesis was to defend the idea that women can be equally dangerous to men, I've become increasingly interested in depictions of women as dangerous, and especially how feminists depict women as dangerous, be that in their accounts of the Amazons or their treatment of women as kind of monstrous. Yeah. So in particular, I've turned to Gabrielle Suchon, who's a 17th century French philosopher. And she, unlike most of the women in my dissertation, she's writing in complete isolation. She is not well connected to any intellectual circles. She was a member of the minor gentry, and she was then sent to a convent. We don't know the precise details about her life, but she eventually left the convent and advocated for women to be able to live on their own, to study independently, and not be under the authority of either husbands or priests in the cloister. So she's kind of a unique thinker, and I've become very interested in her depictions of women because they seem really unflattering. So throughout her treatise, she wants to describe how women are deformed by certain patriarchal institutions. She wants to say, look, if you think women are overly emotional, well, it's because they're constrained in these ways that makes them really emotional. If you think they gossip too much, it's because they aren't taught anything better. Like that's how they use their intellectual capacities is to gossip. If you worry that they are sometimes seditious and a bit rebellious against their husbands, it's because they're never given any chance in their life to exercise authority. Yeah. So she is quite upfront that women are deformed in a lot of ways by patriarchy. But what's most striking, I think, about her work is that she doesn't minimize these deformities. Mm-hmm. She really exaggerates it by comparing women to kind of like wondrous phenomena. She says women's emotions are like earthquakes and like thunderstorms. Their gossip she compares to wildfires and apocalypses. And things like them being slightly seditious and disobeying their husbands, she compares to the great rebellion of the Amazons who murder their husbands. So my basic research question with Suchon is, okay, why is she describing women? It's one thing to describe women as deformed by patriarchy, but why exaggerate these deformities? Exactly. And I think that actually she's trying to intervene in this debate about whether or not women are monsters or wonders. So the basis of that debate, like most things in the Renaissance, comes from Aristotle. Aristotle made a comment about how women are kind of deformed men and sort of like monsters, because monsters were understood to be the product of too much heat or too little heat during conception. And similarly, women were produced when conception lacked the heat requisite to bring about a male child. So then you'd get a woman. So that idea that women were monsters was actually quite an important debate in the Renaissance. People wanted to explain, okay, he said that women are deformed men, that they're kind of like monsters, but they can't really be monsters because nature intends them. So Suchon, I think, is interesting because she decides to say, yes, women are monsters. They are these kind of wondrous phenomena that are against nature's intention. They are like earthquakes and wildfires. But instead, instead by saying that she's monsters, she tries to point to the political causes of monsters. So rather than being a product of some an insufficient heat during conception, she shows that it's these political institutions that are constraining them that are creating women's monstrosity.
And I think that's really interesting because it kind of it also becomes a kind of debate over whether the kind of innate, inborn, biological, as we would call them, kind of reasons that women are what they are, or whether it's a kind of it's a cultural kind of production, which is of course a very modern debate. But then it as well, and something that is still in very central actually, kind of how the dialogue between nature and culture in some sense still very but it's interesting when you describe in the case of Suchon that even these kind of earthquake, so what you are describing are actually kind of quite physical phenomena, but then they still kind of underlining that they come from culture. It's a deformation that comes from culture. So it kind of becomes an understanding where culture actually has really, in some sense, kind of bodily consequences in the sense,
Yeah, totally. Because like earthquakes, she said, like earthquakes happen when any kind of monster or wonder, she says, it happens when things are out of place in the natural order. So an earthquake is when air, which is its natural places in the sky, it gets caught in subterranean caverns. So when things are out of their place, they become upset, disjointed, and they burst forth. So so that's the case with all sorts of wonders, like monsters. Oh, these things aren't in their proper place. It's not the right amount of heat. And then like monsters and sort of wonders burst forth. So what she's saying is that women, it's not an accident that these are happening. It's the political institutions that are removing women from their proper place, which is a place of equality with men. And that's what's causing them to burst forth, to be emotional and rebellious in all of these sorts of ways. And it's interesting the extent to which she does say that cultural has this like physical effect on our bodies. Like she talks about how the constraints women face lower their body temperatures. She talks about how women face constraints in their homes, and this constraint affects their heart, which then weakens their heart and lowers their whole body temperature. And with the lower body temperature, women become unable to control their emotions.
Oh, okay.
So Aristotle said, oh, it's just because women have low blood, like because of this problem during conception, women have lower body temperatures throughout their lives. This weakens their hearts, and that's why they can't control their emotions. Yeah. And Suchon wants to say, no, it's even these political constraints that are weakening their hearts. And she compares it to, like, if I gave you venom, she said that could weaken your heart and lower your body temperature. Yeah. So she compares constraints to, like, venom that have this physical effect on women.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think also from a very kind of contemporary feminist point of view that it, and then of course in Suchon's context it would also be important to have those arguments because it takes the blame away from God. So because it couldn't be nature, because nature is kind of basically kind of acting out God's will of what is good. So you can't blame God for the monsters, and then you need something else. But and then that becomes society and the oppression of women. So it's also, so we are kind of, you could see an argument there where the oppression of women is kind of against God's will, basically, kind of, and also going back to the fact that Suchon was in convent, and that this is very much kind of written within a contemporary, her contemporary theological Catholic context as well. And
yeah, totally, because I think this is the problem that some authors were having in the Renaissance, was saying that women are deformed men and kind of against nature's or God's intention, but how could they be both, how could God or nature have intended this kind of deformity? Yeah. So Suchon offers a much more consistent solution, which is just God and nature do not intend for women to be deformed or inferior. Yeah. Like the intention is equality. Yeah. So,
and then after the paper on Suchon, which is published in Polity, I think?
Or Political Theory.
Political Theory, yeah. So you can find it there, dear listeners. Then you have been going on and looking at monsters also kind of a little bit broader in later projects and projects which are related. And because Mary Jo is now working at the University of Jyväskylä as a postdoc in a project called Gender in Renaissance and Early Modern Philosophy, where she's working with me and other colleagues here at the University of Jyväskylä, and so you're kind of working on basically your second article on monsters. But is there something that you want to kind of add to what you have been talking about in the Suchon? What will be kind of, what direction has the monster thinking?
So I'm increasingly thinking that to explore this question of monsters, like I'm interested in other responses to this monster problem. Mm-hmm. How can women be deformed men and also like part of nature's intentions? Yeah. So I'm interested in other feminist responses to this. And one way that I want to try and explore these questions of how women responded to this monster problem is to look at their depictions of the Amazons, is one way of going about it. Yeah. Because the Amazons were understood by the Greeks and then in their reception in the Renaissance as a kind of monstrous race. So the problem with monsters is the term is quite loose and refers to very disparate phenomena. So on one hand, a monster can just be like a congenital defect. Like if you're born without an arm, that's a monster. Mm-hmm. But monsters are also found, you find whole species of monsters at the borders of the known world. So like Pliny is talking about in Cynthia, you're going to find all of these different types of monstrous creatures and races. And the Amazons are one such example, that there are these women who subvert the natural order, who take up arms, overthrow men, and run society as a matriarchy. So I think in light of the fact that the Amazons were understood as this kind of monstrous species, it can make us look a little bit differently at feminist texts in the Renaissance and early modern period. Because the Amazons are consistently invoked as examples of female virtue and women's capacity for governance, which is really interesting when you think of the fact that they were understood as monsters. Mm-hmm, yeah. So I think increasingly what I'm going to go in this project is an exploration of different depictions of the Amazons and how the Amazons are used as a way to intervene in this debate about women's monstrosity, either by reclaiming the Amazons and saying, like, actually, the Amazons are great. Look at how great it is to have a matriarchy. Or as a way of perhaps inspiring horror in the readers and showing it, the Amazons are a little bit horrifying. Men ought to be careful if they're going to subjugate women because they might end up facing some retaliation.
And then the topic of the kind of the species of monsters is interesting also from the point of view of thinking of not just gender but also the kind of the racialization and the ways in which different groups of people are racialized and seen a little bit kind of to be on the borderline of humanity. So it's a topic that it has very much to do also with critical philosophy, topics within critical philosophy of race and the kind of questions that you would ask on how have people been kind of seen as being of different races. And perhaps I would first just ask you to what extent, so have you when you have started to look a little bit at the monsters as a species, how much have you been doing that? Have you been thinking about that in relationship to a kind of critical concept of what race is? It's
really tricky because there's not always a lot, especially in the say feminist texts, like texts by women, it's not clear that they're treating the Amazons as like, the Greeks certainly, to the extent that the Greeks have like a concept of race, it's at least the Greeks versus the barbarians, and the Amazons are following into the barbarian camp. So I only have very preliminary thoughts on the subject. But it's not clear to me that there's a lot of feminist authors who are treating the Amazons as racialized in this way. There is a possibility that certain male authors are. So like, for example, Hobbes mentions the Amazons in every iteration of his political theory. He doesn't it's not clear that he racializes them, except for one particular bit of evidence, which is the frontispiece of his work De Cive, which has on the front of it an Amazon and you can tell it's an Amazon because she has a strap over her breast, because the Amazons would perform these radical mastectomies so that they could better carry their bows. She's carrying a bow, she's wearing like a feather skirt, and in the background you see the state of liberty, which for Hobbes is a very bad thing, libertas. It's there's war in the background, there's no agriculture, you see a fire, and roasting over this fire is a human limb, so there's instances of cannibalism. So some people say that maybe if people are talking about the Amazons, they're thinking about the Amazons in the New World, these accounts of matriarchal societies in the Americas. So I think for some scholars, they say, if people mention the Amazons, they're trying to invoke this idea of primitive matriarchies that are being discovered in Americas. So I'll have to do more investigating to see to what extent women's accounts of the Amazons are being influenced by these New World accounts of matriarchies.
That's really interesting, and also kind of to some extent the background then of your future research project. If we kind of move on then from equality to monsters, then to your research proposal for things you want to look at, which concerns slavery and marriage, the connection between a specific author and a specific author on marriage and a specific work actually on marriage and slavery. So do you want to say a bit more about that?
So part of the next research project is inspired by just wanting to deal with head-on questions about to what extent do women and feminists in the early modern period really know about these accounts of the New World? To what extent are they really thinking about race? Because, and I limit myself in this project basically to thinking about the long 18th century in England, which is from like 1688 until the beginning of the 19th century. One of those numbers.
1800s.
Anyway, so that long century. And basically in this period, there's a lot of feminist works coming out, works that are defending the equality and worth of women, and really criticizing marriage. And it's almost ubiquitous in all of these texts to claim that marriage is a kind of slavery. So we see this, it's most famously known in Mary Astl's text, where she says, if all men are born free, why is it that all women are born slaves? Yeah. And there's a little bit of scholarship which is really trying to understand why Mary Astle compares slavery to marriage, but it's pretty ubiquitous. Lots of people, lots of women in particular, are comparing slavery to marriage in this time. Now, the scholarly consensus seems to be largely that these women didn't know about chattel slavery. Chattel slavery, especially Britain's involvement in it in this period, is relatively new. So the Royal Africa Company, which really marks the start of Britain's major participation in the transatlantic slavery, didn't happen until the 1670s. Yeah. So it's a relatively new thing, and scholars generally agree it wasn't a big matter of public discussion. So these women, when they say marriage is like slavery, they don't mean to invoke the image of chattel slavery, but instead they're drawing on the Neo-Roman Republican account of slavery. So the Neo-Roman Republican account of slavery is that any institution in which you can be arbitrarily interfered with is marriage. Yeah. So if you're subject to an absolute monarch and he arbitrarily raises your taxes, that's a form of slavery. So women are comparing marriage to this kind of slavery. It's just a kind of arbitrary interference. So the point of this project is to challenge that assumption and show that actually women are well aware of chattel slavery in North America, and it's actually really influencing their thoughts and how they understand the oppression they're experiencing in their own marriage. So I do this by centering not a traditional philosophical work, but a literary one, a novel called Orinoco by England's first female professional writer, Opera Ben. So the novel tells the story of Orinoco, an African prince, who is treacherously abducted, taken to Suriname, to a plantation where he's enslaved, and he unsuccessfully leads a slave rebellion with his wife, which ends tragically. It's unsuccessful, and him and his wife commit suicide because they would rather die than live as slaves. Yeah. So this was a remarkably popular work at the time. It was adapted for the stage, and women are citing Opera Ben a lot because she's taken as both a model of a woman who is a writer and an intellectual. So I think, and actually when you start looking at some of the lesser known feminist writers, you see that they make explicit that they believe slavery is a kind, that marriage is like slavery on the plantations. And they cite Opera Ben making explicit the link between their oppression in marriage and the oppression being experienced by slaves on the plantations. Yeah. So I think turning to this can help us understand not just like the influence of slavery on feminist thought, but also how they understood their own marriages. That they were saying, they actually thought marriage is not just a kind of arbitrary interference. Your husband actually owns you. So they draw on the example of plantation slavery to show the distinct harms associated with being owned that are more serious than just a monarch raising taxes on his subjects. It's like distinctly a kind of wrong associated with being owned.
And then, of course, because of course slavery and even chattel slavery was a very broad, so it might seem somehow kind of odd that how can you compare the sufferings of plantation workers, for example, to marriage, which bourgeois marriage, which however bad it would be, would still not kind of be slave. But then of course slavery, I mean, there were a lot of household slaves. There was a lot of the whole kind of, there were and to the extent that women would have kind of personal contacts, and that would be actually with people who were slaves within a household setting and were owned, and then when you start looking at that, then also the whole idea that a husband owns a wife and has sexual access to the wife, of course, in the same sense as the owner would have had sexual access to female slaves and so on. So there would be several kind of phenomena where it actually makes sense that they are close. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's like several features that the women want to point out as like to draw parallels between like slavery and marriage.
Yeah.
And there's forms of social isolation that you experience.
Yeah.
The women are taken out of their relationships of kin. They can be basically dropped in a family that are essentially strangers to them.
Yeah.
They don't have the freedom to be able to go about without their husbands, to make friends, to make their own social networks. So this idea that it's what Orlando Patterson will call social death. I think the women kind of prefigure this and show that social death is something both you experience, that slaves are experiencing and women are experiencing in marriage.
Yeah.
They focus on the drudgery, right? Like that it's not just the case that the king levies taxes on you. You're actually forced to do types of work that don't involve any sort of like creative input.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a kind of drudgery. And then, of course, just the objectification. They're owned and they're reduced to a kind of commerce. Obviously, this is a really important point about how the whole economy of plantation slavery worked.
Yeah. Yeah.
But same women by the 18th century start articulating the wrongs of marriage in this way, that they are being reduced to a form of commerce that is traded between husbands and fathers. So that's not to say that they are right to compare slavery to marriage. Obviously, I think it papers over a lot of the wrongs of slavery and erases the position of Black women. And I think they do that quite intentionally.
Yeah.
But it still the accounts of slavery in the New World, it gives women these new tools for articulating what's going wrong in their marriages, besides arbitrary interference. Because that is, for them, I think, a pretty superficial wrong. A lot of these women are royalists. They do believe in monarchical absolutism. They think Republican men who are comparing taxation to slavery are silly. So I think these accounts of plantation slavery give them new ways of articulating what's actually wrong in their marriages beyond this kind of arbitrary interference.
Yeah. And one parallel would also be kind of the ownership or the whole kind of parenthood question, and the fact that both wives that they, I mean, so if something happened and they were kicked out of the house by the husbands, then the child would go for the father. So that actually kind of women, and the whole kind of question of reproductive rights to some extent, that wives didn't have any right to the children. Women didn't have any rights to the children in any respect, and that was of course also part of plantation slavery, where mothers didn't have right to the children either, kind of
and that's actually one of like all of these kind of wrongs I've been delineating, I think are found in Opera Ben's novel Orinoco, and especially this one that you've just highlighted.
Okay.
Part of the reason why the two why Orinoco and his wife kill themselves is not just because they don't want to live as slaves, but because Orinoco's wife, Imoinda, is pregnant.
Okay.
And he especially doesn't want other people having control over his children. He doesn't want his children enslaved. So this question of not just control over yourself, but control over your family legacy and these reproductive rights are, at least in this novel, like central to what Orinoco takes to be a wrong of slavery. And you do see it in 18th century women like Sarah Suchon, talking about how they don't get to have a relationship with their children and have this kind of control over their family legacies as part of the harm of patriarchal marriages. So.
And actually then the question of reproductive rights also kind of brings us back to the monsters, because when, so the final topic we would like to talk a little bit about is the question, well, monsters are of course have always been really, really popular in popular culture, starting with Frankenstein and the whole kind of which is of course to some extent also a question of reproductive rights, kind of putting these pieces together and creating new beings and so on, but which has quite recently then been brought again to the screen with the movie Poor Things, which we actually saw together when you had just arrived in Jyväskylä last winter and been talking about a little bit, and which you have been thinking about a little bit also from the perspective of your kind of historical work.
Yeah, I think Poor Things is really interesting. And in general, I understand why Suchon talks about monsters and women, because there's this important Renaissance debate about the ontology of women and whether they're deformed like monsters or whether they're part of nature's intention. Mm-hmm. What's interesting to me is that monsters are still, I think, a really important part of like feminist theorizing or feminist depictions of women, even though we no longer have, we have not inherited this like monster debate. Like we no longer think of nature as having intentions, which can be like accidentally deflected, right? So I think it's really interesting that even after, you know, this whole worldview that says that there's like nature's intentions and deformities from nature's or defects and deformities like monsters, that whole way of viewing the natural order is gone, but monsters still exist and women are still keen to represent themselves as monsters. I find really interesting, especially in this film. Because yeah, in the movie, you're introduced to this character, Bella, who is a monster in the sense that she's certainly contrary to any sort of natural intentions. She is the brain of a baby inside the adult body of a woman.
And that's a result of her wanting to be free, independent. So also in the sense, because isn't it so that it ends up that way because she committed suicide to get rid of her husband.
Yeah.
And then this doctor comes and puts together
it was a pregnant woman who commits suicide, and then the doctor, finding the body, puts the brain of the fetus inside. Replaces the brain of the adult woman with the brain of a fetus. And what I think is so interesting about the movie is how the other characters kind of react to this monstrosity. Because you're introduced to this character that's a monster. It's a baby brain in an adult woman's body. And actually, a character encounters her, Duncan Wedderburn, and he doesn't think she's monstrous at all. This extremely immature but sexually developed woman is someone he thinks is great, like someone to be taken advantage of. So this man runs away with her, clearly intending to exploit her. But as she develops intellectually and her body, and her mind actually begins to match her body, that's when the characters start treating her as monstrous. Because she's not socialized in the normal ways. So she's quite willing to be independent. She doesn't necessarily heed authorities. And a turning point in the movie is that she engages in sex work as a way to make some money. And she doesn't see anything wrong with it. She just thinks, well, this is just one of the skills I have. I can go and sell my body. It's very easy, and I can make some money. And Duncan Wedderburn, the man she has run away with, calls her a monster, a tsunami, a demon, all of this that is meant to torture him, even though her intellect now matches her body. She has given reasons. She is being completely logical about her actions. She has an end. She pursues means to get to that end. And all of a sudden, that's when she's the monster. So I think what it does is, by depicting a woman as a monster in this way, it actually shows us that the monster isn't in the object of the monster itself. The monster is really our reaction to it. So Montaigne actually has a line where he says, what we say is contrary to nature, what we call a monster, is usually just contrary to custom. And I think that's really what this film shows so well, is that we have this monster, this contrary to nature baby in a woman's body. And no one says that's monstrous until she defies customs about what's expected for women. And that's when she becomes the monster. So yeah, I think there's a reason that feminists are always going to gravitate towards this depiction of monsters. If women are constrained more than men by customs, the idea women are going to appear more monstrous when they defy them. So I think even though we no longer believe that there's like monsters as an ontological category that shapes the order, that is part of the order of nature, we still believe that monsters can reveal something about customs. So yeah, that's
And I think also kind of as a feminist topic, monsters, and there might be some form of parallel here also between the role of monsters in somebody like Suchon, and then the role of monsters in Poor Things, and also in the feminist debate over Poor Things, because there's a kind of a certain ambivalence there as well, and in the sense, and I think there's been kind of both the feminist reactions to see Poor Things as a kind of take out the kind of the feminist elements in it, but then there's of course also because it's a quite grotesque film, and also because it's kind of stronger. So even if it was Suchon's text or Hobbes and Cavendish on the Amazons, they are also kind of to some extent grotesque, perhaps in the ways in which they depict the women. But then because they are texts, then it's not so kind of you can take more from a text than from a film. But in this film, it kind of brings out the kind of the grotesquity of the ways in which sexuality is depicted and so on, which is also kind of quite provocative. And it just came to my mind that there's to some extent, because you mentioned this Hobbes's front piece with the depiction of the Amazons, and of course also kind of in early modern times, so there were some pictures, and sometimes it's quite often kind of in the pictures where you actually see the problems and the ambiguities, and it's in the pictures where you can see, for example, these elements of racialization, which wouldn't necessarily be there in the text, but then when you look at the pictures, you see that actually the Amazons, at least Hobbes, who was well aware of the pictures, I think he's known for having been kind of involved in the production of those pictures, was kind of aware that they are racialized, and then there would be kind of some similar elements in Poor Things also, where and then it becomes the problem that even if. So what can you kind of, what means can you use in order,
That's interesting, because I mean I think some feminist criticisms, they take issue with probably the first part not being sufficiently monstrous, where it's this baby in a woman's body, that everyone's reacting kind of happily to this and that it's sexualized.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people probably think we should be reacting more, like that should be more grotesque. It shouldn't be as sexy as it appears in the film.
Yeah.
And that's a fair point, but I do think the intention of the film is to say, well, look, that this is obviously the grotesque, monstrous thing. This is the deformity here.
Yeah.
But that people that the character like Duncan Weddenberg, this male character, isn't able to see any deformity until she defies customs, and particularly his authority. So I understand, I think there's even debates, there's lots of debates about whether or not, should you be depicting women as monsters, or is it too grotesque, is it insufficiently grotesque? Those are debates scholars are having right now about Hobbes's Amazons, I think it parallels the ones that are happening about this film.
Thank you. Here we again see these really interesting parallels between. So why to be interested in the history of philosophy? We have this wonderful parallel. But thank you so much, Mary Jo. I think this was a really good conversation.